Can I sort of provide something of a counterpoint to that, I think? Jazz, I think, certainly has that element of learning a variety of tropes and assembling those in a way that works in new ways or says old things again in a new way. But there's also an element of first learning those, presenting the structure, and then stretching or breaking the structure and returning to it, right? And in a way, it's a way of evolving what we know by pushing it, by being curious about where we can take it. And that really is the way the evolutionary process works as well. So I want to bring that back around to what tools are and sort of unorthodox use of tools. That's the way we evolve new functions in a biological sense, right? The old tool gets used in a way that it wasn't, in a sense, intended for, although there's no intention in evolution, really. But it evolved as a result of a particular function, right? And yet a new sort of circumstance is encountered, and we do new things with it. And that's, I think, one of the big differences between jazz and sort of highly structured music like Baroque is that new things happen, right? And they're jazz, like sort of free jazz, you really are doing something not far from wandering off into you know, a new area of Google search in some ways and bringing it back, right?
Well, we need to talk about that later, I think. But I do like the repurposing argument of I think that's the most exciting thing about tools, is using them for something that they're not quite intended for, and the worlds that opens up.
So we have quite a few questions, and I'm going to try to sort of combine some of these, but I want to read them in their entirety. But I think there are some themes that we can pick out from them. One is, how can a person tell when they are not being curious? Are there tools for this? Okay. And is curiosity innate? If so, what does that say about the capability of tools to cultivate curiosity? And this one is, I could give a pot of white paint to anyone, but how do I give it to the teacher who will turn it into the tool as described? AKA, how do the tools How do tools cultivate our own curiosity, and what tools enable other people's curiosity? So I'm kind of hearing some questions about the origins of curiosity. How do we cultivate it? How do we support other people in it? And then specifically a question about teaching, and how do you sort of cultivate a classroom environment where that type of teaching is supported? Yeah? Jocelyn?
I think for me, especially dealing with students who have already been through the college system and who are master's students and have already sort of been trained in a particular way, when they come into class, they're very outcome oriented, which is, in my opinion, one of the quickest ways to kill curiosity. Because if you have a due date and you have a really strict set of guidelines, or even like a rubric, like, what happens is people try to do that, and they work really hard at that final product, and they spend less of their time working on all of the stuff that comes before that, which is where curiosity lives. So what I say going into class is that, like, actually I'm okay with failure. Like, I don't care if you can't complete the final project as long as you can show me that you tried. And what I do is emphasize that, like, it's okay to be frustrated because you're learning these new technologies and they're really hard and kind of scary. And some of them are designed to be hard and scary, and that's okay. But we can talk about it, and you don't have to just get turned off and stop or try to do something that's within your scope. Like, I explicitly say, I would rather you fail at doing something you're learning than succeed at doing something you're already good at. And so for me, accepting frustration and failure, which sounds like a really depressing classroom, actually turns into a really productive and fun place to be, I think.
Okay, more little kid stuff. I think that one of the ways that you build curiosity is by putting a lot of different tools and a lot of different resources and a lot of different materials in the hands or in the reach of children or in the reach of any of us. I think that one of the things I discovered about myself when I was doing my dissertation, much of my research in this building, was that I had to find increasingly boring parts of the building to sit in because I would look at anything else on the shelf and I would browse the shelves and read anything other than have to actually do my own work. And so I think that there's an innate curiosity that is built when you give children or we give ourselves any number of things that can be used as tools for learning. So for instance, and I'm sorry for all of the kindergarten references, we do actually teach 8 other grade levels at Falk, but the ones that keep coming to mind are the kindergarten ones. One of the things that we give children access to, and I think of space as a tool. Our building was very intentionally redesigned 7 years ago to be a teaching tool in and of itself. So hallways are shaped in certain ways to create certain kinds of sensibilities and feelings. There are lots of little nooks where learning can take place. The building is intentionally designed to be a tool for teaching and for learning. One of the spaces that we have is a playground that is only for kids in kindergarten, that is outside of the 2 classrooms, and it is intentionally empty. There's nothing in it. Now, children drag things out there, but we don't put anything there. There's no playground equipment. There are no monkey bars. There are no swings. There are no things that engage children in anything other than their own curiosity. And so depending on the year, children make this space into things as groups and as individuals that are very different. So some years they're engineers, and so, or civic engineers. So they're building rivers and lakes, and we're very good with mess at Falk School. So children get very muddy and they're carrying buckets of water and they're creating water features because that's what they're into, and that space spoke to them and enhanced their curiosity in that way. Other years, they're kids who are wild about the World Cup and they love soccer, so it is constantly a World Cup soccer pitch, and it's Brazil versus Argentina every other day. And then other years, it's a mud pie kitchen. And so children are planning weddings and other events, and they're building all of the food, or they're baking all of the food to go along with it. And so I think that oftentimes space itself can be a tool, but one of the ways we build curiosity is we give kids lots of things and we say, what do you think about these things? What can you make out of these materials? Which then become tools.
So I guess I can comment on the question about whether curiosity is innate and essentially in our species. But let's cast a wider net here. You know, I don't think we're the only curious beings out there. If anyone has sat around in the presence of raccoons for a while, you would see that they're actually freakishly smart, and they'll kind of mess with you. And crows are also known to be very smart. Octopi, chimpanzees, and for example, and it's these exact same species that are also the same ones that have been observed to use tools in nature. So we're not the only ones. And it's an interesting observation that they go hand in hand. You know, what came first? I guess the innate curiosity led to the ability to create tools in a way. So that is a really neat question. You know, tools can still enable further in new curiosities, I suppose, but I think I would feel that the curiosity is just in all of us. And it's what's allowed us to adapt to our environment and adapt the environment to us, and that's why we're so successful. At least if we don't destroy our planet. Yeah.
I think curiosity is innate, but I also think that lack of curiosity is innate. And I suspect there's a strong evolutionary reason for that as well. Like, gee, I wonder what it would be like to climb on the back of this grizzly bear. You know, you might not survive to pass your genes on in that case. And I'm thinking that might be the case also with, well, certainly with my art form, where people tend to favor, music has more repetition per square yard than any other art form, because it takes a lot to sort of get the hang of something. So we tend to have many more patterns and much more repetition than in speech, for instance. And people like that a lot. Phil Glass is the most popular composer alive on the planet today. And there's a reason for that. And so I'm thinking with curiosity that one of the things that makes it possible or that helps us, that one of the most successful strategies is to have some constraints so that you have a sort of safe playing field where there's familiar stuff, but you can, within that, like finding the most boring place in the library to work in. I mean, that seems like a great idea to me. And aesthetically, it works as well. If we set up constraints for ourselves, then we can exercise a very deep curiosity about a relatively manageable number of things and go into it safely. And we can even lead a listener into that domain as well, if we're lucky.
Any other questions in the audience? I saw hands up before I read those questions, so I know they're out there. Yes.
I actually have a question. We talked about space, but mostly we've been focusing on tools as physical and external things, and I was wondering about the mental tools that I feel like we have. I know that sometimes we use tool as an analogy, like, oh, you've been given the tools for success, but I was also thinking about as I study biology and computer science, I feel like I'm developing mental tools to approach problems in different ways, and I just thought if we could talk about that a little bit and what people's perspectives were, and whether also that ended a tool and became an ability, because I was also thinking about music a little bit, and my ability now as a musician to partition time and to anticipate when I should come and join in with my instrument. Is that an ability or a tool, and where do they collide?
Good question.
Yeah. I never thought about that as the mental tools thing. I'm going to give me a moment.
Well, I can volunteer the teachers to speak about it. Because certainly the methods that you approach a classroom can be thought of as tools as well, so I'll let them speak while I try to think of a better answer myself.
Well, I think your question's really provocative, and I like that you've sort of created this this binarism between, say, tools and aptitudes. You know, when does something stop being a tool, and when does it become an aptitude that is kind of ingrained within what we all do? So I'm thinking of some of the recent research about children and resilience, and what a lot of scholars are talking about is grit, this stick-to-itness that is a tool or maybe an aptitude that leads to success, that perseverance is something that we don't teach very much in a culture that has become very focused on everybody gets a trophy, everybody succeeds, personal self-esteem is the most important thing that happens, nobody should ever experience any failures, and so we create a kind of pothole-less road for children. And one of the things that I think builds curiosity is possible sort of overcoming adversity by sticking with things. And so that is, I think, a tool that can be used that, you know what, I can get through this. But I don't know about the difference between what is a tool and what becomes an aptitude. It's a great question.
Yeah. So in library school, it might not shock you to learn we're really preoccupied with categorization. And so that's a tool, right? Like learning the Dewey Decimal Code or the Library of Congress system is a tool. But also learning how to categorize things in your head and sort of structure things differently. So, for example, if you want to learn to code, a common type of coding is called object-oriented code. What that means is that you have basically an abstract representation of something that then can be implemented in a number of different places. So, I don't know, one tool might be read Plato, right? Because the idea of the Platonic ideal form is actually pretty useful for conceptualizing implementation of object-oriented coding. And my student who wanted to make the sort of iterative color patterns had to make that project successful, he had to stop thinking of it as like this sort of, it was like color A, B, and C, right? He had to stop thinking about the colors themselves and abstract them to color A, color B, color C, and then figure out how to make A, B, and C go in a bunch of different ways. And so I think at least for that project or for a lot of digital tools, one of the tricks and one of the sort of internal tools to have is figuring out how to talk to the tool in the way that you need to. There's a sort of like middle language you have to, or like a translation you have to do where you say, I have an idea, this tool understands a particular thing, how do I get from A to B, right? So I think that's one way. I hope that's an answer. I think that's one way to think about that.
I think this gets at another question that we posed to the panelists in advance. We were just sort of kicking around some ideas before the panel. And that question is, what can we learn about adaptation and discovery by looking at how we work with tools? And so, that sort of brings some of the questions about, is this innate? Is this learned? Is it thwarted? Is it, all these different components? We'll give them all time to think. Anybody have other questions? Yes, Nate.
I'm still puzzling on that question about the difference between tools and aptitudes, and I really like the direction you took, which was to talk about this middle language. And I think we're talking about the relationship between curiosity, which is something I would agree is innate to some degree, and how that relates to tools, which we oftentimes think of as being external to us in some way. And the development of this middle language, which is where the practice of a musical instrument allows you to innovate or explore your curiosity, express things more fluently. I would think about it as a fluency in some kind of middle language between tool and idea, or tool and curiosity. So I guess I'd throw that out there to see what you think. Are you onto something there with this fluency of a middle language between object, whether it be a digital tool like you use, Nathan, or an analog tool like a flute or a oboe or.
Yeah, he just answered your question. That's what I would have said if I'd been a little smarter. But yeah, that's terrific. I think one thing that's true about what Kate was mentioned earlier is that we really have a very different, young composers, for instance, are thinking about the world in a very different way in the musical world than our teachers did, for instance, my teachers did. Part of it's technology and the availability of tools, but that's shifted the whole meta language of music and of thinking about music and how to make music. So even if the ways of playing instruments haven't changed that much, the ideas about them and have shifted, and so in the middle ground has sort of moved the whole thing around.
Other comments or questions? Yes, Kirk in the back, I see.
One of the themes across all three sessions has been about pedagogy and also about the difference between kids and adults and their curiosities. It's not surprising to me that you are actually bringing up kindergarten a lot, because kindergarten is this wonderful example of where there's pots of paint and tools and just lots of possibilities, and kids who are just delighted by the multiplicity of possibilities. Now let's fast forward. We're in college. Kids want a lengthy syllabus. It tells them exactly what they're supposed to do, and they want rubrics and all those things. And I'm not dissing that. I understand where it comes from. I understand that it's partly that's the way they gain mastery, is by having very, very clear expectations and so on. And that also holds us as teachers accountable in a new way. But on the other hand, as a teacher, we miss this. The syllabus is a tool. The rubric is a tool. These are pedagogical tools. and we feel them as confining, as constraining, and constraining us. We can't improvise because we're locked into this, but also constraining the students, even more so constraining the students. So I'm curious about your reactions to that, and how do we open up how can we design new pedagogical tools that give us the ability to improvise, to have an emergent, I'm going to use your term, I'm going to have from now on, it's going to be an emergent syllabus. That's what I'm going to write, right? So, but literally, if we took that as a metaphor, what would an emergent syllabus look like?
I mean, as a both current and former student, I think this goes back to the idea of improvisation being, you get really good at something and then you start playing around with it, because I think if a student does sort of gain mastery of that hyper-structured kind of education, then the improvisation happens where you say, okay, this is a constraint, which makes it a challenge, which means I'm going to have fun with this in whatever way I can. And then I think that what happens is that then curiosity sort of re-enters back into the picture if they've been able to retain that, where you have all of these sort of hyper-confining pedagogical tools, but you learn how to be flexible and curious within those and use them to your advantage or press up against them. I don't, and I know that student in myself and others, but I don't know how you teach someone to be that student, especially when, primary education, in a lot of cases, is not teaching people how to do that. So maybe you have an idea of how to make that happen.
I also want to pose that to the undergraduates that I know are here. I know you're here. So if you have thoughts on that, we would really love to hear about it. So think about that. And I also would just want to offer a story from my own an art history class I had in graduate school, where it was a class that surprised me, because we had this reading packet back when we had reading packets. It was about that thick. And there was no syllabus. It was just a reading packet. And so there was an idea, a conversation that we began with. This was Steve Melville at Ohio State University. Got to give him credit. It was amazing. And, we just sort of looked at where the discussion went during the day, during the class. And at the end of the class, we decided what our questions were. And then he helped us select readings from the packet, this predetermined thing, that would be most appropriate in propelling our questions forward for the next week. And each class ended that way. So you never knew what was going to be assigned until the end of the discussion. And we were reading Lacan, and we were reading all these, intense things, and we were all in way over our heads, of course, But it was a really nice way to explore and have that sort of emergent curriculum experience. But any undergrads that want to speak to that? Yes, wonderful.
If you don't mind if I speak again, I got really fired up over that rubric question, because I think one woman's tools, another woman's stumbling block. With regards to the rubric, I'm an intensely curious person, but I've learned to frame this as I'm also an intensely anxious person, and they're two sides of the same coin. And for me, an empty syllabus, which is something that I have in quite a few of my programming classes, is the most frightening and constraining thing, and it's something that really prevents me from exploring my interests. Whereas I took a molecular bio course that was incredibly structured, and I knew exactly what was expected of me. And that meant that once I had learned that portion for the exam, to my heart's content, I used that Google search engine and followed every link I could think of to learn more and more about a certain protein, about a certain chemical process. But when the whole world of that class is out there, and I could be tested on any of it, and I am obsessed with that achievement in the end of being tested, then my curiosity is kept at bay, because I need to focus on just memorizing. That's my perspective.
So I'm not I'm a scientist and not a professional educator. I guess I am an educator, but I didn't study education, so I hope I don't get too far out of bounds here. I agree with the fact that curiosity is obviously very good, and it's very good for problem solving and just taking us to places we never would have imagined. But there are also other purposes of education, right? To teach problem-solving skills that may not involve any curiosity, or just being able to have kind of a corpus of knowledge that will become helpful in some applied field as well. But I guess achieving a nice balance of having, a rigid syllabus versus having things like frequent opportunities for the students to go and take some of the tools they've learned in that chapter, for example, and then apply them in creative ways is a good way of going about a class. It's certainly a way that I teach one of my courses is we teach tools and then we just open up the world to the students and let them ask their own questions. So that should be greatly funded by curiosity and just let them apply the tools that we just taught them. And I'm glad to see there are lots of movements in education these days that are making that kind of flip much more frequent than just one class project per se, but very frequently. So.
Yeah, we have a question in the front.
Not wishing to be too concrete, there is currently a competition which has just been announced called Protohype. It is a joint initiative between Tech Shop and you're familiar with this?
The Tech Shop.
Okay, so it essentially is a collaboration or competition between faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students at the university and Tech Shop. Its goal is to essentially enable people to envision a prototype and work with the teams at Tech Shop to create it. Right? This is an opportunity where one might bring very intensive technical tools and unrestrained curiosity into the same playing field. And I just wondered, one, if you guys knew about that, and two, what your comments would be on
it. Does everyone know what Tech Shop is? I mean, it's in Bakery Square, yes, and it is a space that is an open kind of discovery space for kids and adults. Lots of adults go there to build and tinker and explore and use tools that they may not actually have or most likely don't have at home. Most people don't have a laser cutter at home, and most people probably don't have a 3D printer at home. But you can use these sorts of things, both kind of high-tech, digital tech, and lower-tech sorts of things to build and create. So that's what Tech Shop is. I mean, I think that one of the things that a question I have actually for the group that comes out of your question is that there's this competitive aspect of this. And does competition lead to curiosity? Does curiosity need or does it benefit from some sense of competition, or is curiosity better built through collaboration? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I know what we privilege at Falk School, which is collaboration, not competition. But that doesn't mean that competition doesn't inspire people to use their curiosity to solve problems.
The question was why dichotomize it? Why can't it be both?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I think that we do tend to culturally dichotomize them, that collaboration is something that I suppose there are collaborative groupings and work groupings, labs and so forth, that compete with other labs, and maybe they build curiosity in that way. We tend to favor thinking about a world where people are collaborating without extrinsic rewarding. Now, this becomes something that is this is a whole other conversation about intrinsic and extrinsic reward. Why do you do the things you do? To build more curiosity, to become a learned person, to feel good about yourself, or do you do it because there's some kind of prize waiting? And so we sometimes take this to too large of an extreme at Falk School. So, for instance, we often historically have not had children engage in competitions that would actually make them feel good about themselves and the things that they've learned, because we don't want some children to win the science fair and other children to not.
I think going back to that idea of the middle language. So in my class and in my own case, when you are the person who has the creative idea, and you're curious about it and you want to learn how to do that, how to use a tool to do it, you yourself have to learn that middle language and learn how to communicate with and talk to that tool in some way. It gets a little bit more complicated in collaborations where the division of labor is someone has the idea and someone knows how to use the tool. I think it's a cool idea, but there's a whole field about this called the Digital Humanities, right? Where you have a bunch of humanities scholars, and you have some of them doing that work of learning how to use a tool and using it to do a project, but you also have some who are partnering with people who have technical skills, who then do the work for them. And to me, it's like a really complex division of labor, because I don't know if the person who has the idea is learning to speak that middle language with the tool. Clearly, they have to communicate with the person who's going to use the tool. But my question in a situation like that is that person just there to be like the idea man, or is that person actually moving, like learning something, right? Is that person learning how to accomplish this? Is that person speaking a different language? Is that person, how is that person interacting with the final project? It's not that I think one is better than the other, but I think it's sort of two different examples of how that kind of idea plays out.
So we're actually nearing the end, and I want to invite each of you on the panel to offer any sort of final thoughts or questions that you're left with as we conclude.
Let's see. I was going to say, well, as somebody in an incredibly competitive field, I have to say that I really enjoy collaboration and community. And the competition can be pretty wearying after a while. It may be fine for a very prescribed, constrained effort, something you're really shooting for, single goal, and then you can relax afterwards. But as a way of life, let me tell you, it's really not the best way to try to live. And but I guess getting back to sort of tools in general, tools are. I mean, I can't imagine working the way in which we can perceive the world and continue to perceive the world in all sorts of ways, whether aesthetically or otherwise. It's great to have these things available that allow us to do it. For instance, you notice these fans that have been going on all the time. I've been really getting into them because, and if I looked a little distracted up here, sometimes it's because I was hearing the cycle of them. There's an amplitude surge in them every so often, and it's very rhythmic and musical. And the reason why I can appreciate that is because I've spent so much time doing field recordings with my little handheld field recorder tool, or the one on my iPhone, which is almost as good now, and then playing those back and analyzing those and putting them in pieces of music. So I encourage you all to keep expanding especially the world of sound, which most of us, frankly, I know, and you all do it, we all do it, because we're very visually oriented, but just close your eyes and listen to the world around you sometime. And tools might help you do that, and there are a lot of them out there.
So one final thought that I would have, which has not much to do with tools, but has everything to do with curiosity, is the question that I didn't even answer earlier, which was about whether or not curiosity is something that's innate or if it's something that's learned. And I think that all of us who are educators would like to believe that it's innate. I think oftentimes it is, maybe always it is, but it's often dormant. And as educators, if we don't believe that it's something that people can learn to cultivate and become more curious through the activities and the experiences that we provide for them, then there's no reason for us to have the institution that we're sitting in. And so I think that it is a learned attribute, but we can hope that it's in everybody. It just might remain dormant longer in some.
Well, to somewhat comment on the last question as well, I think competition can be a nice spring of achievement and even curiosity, right? And especially in a group setting. In my own work, and I found that, working together can help us align our curiosities, right? Maybe someone is more technical and he's thinking, how does this work, right? And maybe the big idea person is thinking, what could we do that's new with this? And someone in between is how can I get these two people to talk to each other? All these kind of different kinds of curiosities can be aligned. And I guess you could think of leadership structure, or lack thereof, a way of people working together could also be thought of as an organizational tool as well.
Someone talked, maybe Kate at the beginning, talked about whether it's important to pause, or that pause before you use the tool. And I think, even as this sort of person who teaches digital technology classes, I think there's something to be said for giving kids Legos instead of Minecraft, or for at least being thoughtful about the way that you decide to introduce tools to a situation. Because I think if you push, especially with digital tools, if you push that before people even have a chance to ask any questions, I think that it can get in the way. And so I think that that ability to pause, to say, okay, do I need this? Do I need this tool? Do I think I need it? Will it serve some kind of function for me? Can do a lot, especially thinking about curiosity remaining dormant, which I really like, because I think we've been dancing around in a couple of different ways the idea of where curiosity lives in education now. I think that one way to work with that is to slow down and ask questions before we start throwing technology at stuff, which sounds weird from the technology person. But yeah, that's what I think.
So before we conclude, I want to mention that Nate and I are exploring how we might continue these discussions over the next year. And so we've left our business cards, at the table that you checked in at. And so we would love to hear from you and hear what your ideas are, what you think worked, what you think didn't work, questions that you have, or ideas, any sort of reaction. So please send us an email or chat, and we'd love to hear how you've experienced all of these. And we hope to see you in April. So thanks.